A lavish evening in Milan. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and a waltz echoed through the air. A young billionaire stood at the center of the hall, dressed in a sleek black tuxedo. Handsome face, cold eyes, untouchable. Beside him, a girl in a simple dress, nervous glance, trembling hands. She was just hired, a contract girlfriend, nothing more. But then as the music slowed, he leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Just one kiss." The entire room fell silent. No one knew that a contract written in black ink would lead to something far stronger, a bond written on the heart. Let me introduce you to Elena, 26 years old, a talented design graduate working 3 part-time jobs just to stay afloat. She had student loans crushing her, bills piling up, and a younger brother, Marco, who was sick, really sick, the kind of sick that required expensive treatments, specialists, medications she couldn't afford. Elena wore a simple leather bracelet every day. Marco had made it for her when he was 10, back when things were easier, back when their parents were still alive. Now it was just the two of them, and Elena would do anything to save him. Then there was Adrian, 32 years old, tech billionaire, self-made, cold, ruthless. He'd come from nothing. Grew up in a cramped apartment with his mother, who worked 3 jobs herself. He remembered the hunger, the shame, the desperation. Now he had everything: money, power, influence. But he was alone, and his board of directors didn't like that. You need stability, they said, a partner, someone who makes you look human. Adrian hated the idea, but he understood the game, so he agreed. On one condition, it would be on his terms. No socialite looking for fame, no heiress chasing his fortune. He wanted someone real, someone who wouldn't pretend to love him, someone who would simply play the part and leave. That's when Elena's name came up. A mutual acquaintance suggested her. She's desperate, needs money fast. She won't ask questions. Adrian looked at her profile. Simple, unpolished, not from his world. Perfect. They met in a quiet cafe in Milan. Elena arrived nervous, clutching her old bag, wearing a borrowed dress. Adrian was already there, sitting by the window, a silver pen in his hand. The pen had his company name engraved on it. He always carried it, a reminder of where he'd come from. "You understand the terms?" he asked, sliding a contract across the table. Elena scanned it. 6 months. Public appearances, events, interviews. Act like his girlfriend. Nothing physical required, just appearances. The payment listed at the bottom made her hands shake. It was enough to save Marco. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "Because you won't fall in love with me," he said flatly. "And I won't fall in love with you. It's clean. Simple. Business." Elena swallowed hard. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow night. There's a gala. Wear something nice. I'll send a stylist." He stood, picked up his pen, and walked toward the door. Then he paused. "One more thing," he said without turning around. "Don't get attached. This is a contract, nothing more." Elena stared at the paper in front of her, her heart pounding. She thought of Marco, of the hospital bills, of the desperate sleepless nights wondering how she'd pay for his next treatment. She picked up the pen and signed. That night, alone in her tiny apartment, she looked down at the contract and whispered to herself, "I'm selling my smile for a piece of paper. But I can never sell my heart." She touched the leather bracelet on her wrist. Marco's gift, her reminder of why she was doing this. She didn't know it yet, but she was wrong. The first event was a disaster. Elena wore the designer dress Adrian's stylist had sent. It was beautiful, elegant, but it didn't feel like her. The cameras flashed. The questions flew. "Adrian! Who's the mystery woman? How long have you been together? Is this serious?" Adrian placed his hand on the small of her back, his touch firm and controlled. "This is Elena," he said smoothly. "And yes, it's serious." Elena forced a smile, trying not to flinch under the blinding lights. They walked into the venue together, a sea of designer gowns and expensive suits. Everyone staring, whispering, judging. Elena felt like an imposter. Adrian leaned down, his voice low. Relax, just smile. Pretend you're having fun. I'm trying, she hissed back. Try harder. It was cold, transactional, exactly what they'd agreed to. But as the night went on, something shifted. During the dinner, a journalist asked Elena about herself. So what do you do? Elena hesitated. She could lie, make herself sound more impressive, but instead she told the truth. I'm a designer. Well, trying to be. Right now I'm just working, trying to take care of my family. The journalist smiled, intrigued. And how did you and Adrian meet? Elena glanced at Adrian, who was watching her carefully. We met by chance, she said softly, and somehow we just fit. It wasn't true, but the way she said it felt real. Adrian's expression flickered, just for a moment. Later that night, as they left the event, it started to rain. They ran under the awning of an old church, laughing despite themselves. Adrian took off his jacket and draped it over Elena's shoulders. You did well tonight, he said. I felt like a fraud. You weren't. You were yourself. That's why it worked. Elena looked up at him, rain dripping from his hair, his usual coldness softened by the dim light. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Why did you really choose me? Adrian was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because you reminded me of someone. Who? Myself, before all of this. It was the first real thing he'd said to her, and Elena felt something crack open inside her chest. Over the next few weeks, they attended more events, more dinners, more appearances. And slowly the performance started to feel less like a performance. One evening, Adrian invited Elena to his private office. It was a place no one else was allowed. Not his board, not his staff, no one. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and in the corner, framed on the wall, were his first sketches. The software designs he'd created when he was just a kid in a library, dreaming of something bigger. This is where it all started, he said quietly. Elena walked closer, studying the drawings. You built all of this from these? From these, and a lot of sleepless nights. She turned to him. Why are you showing me this? Adrian met her gaze. Because I don't want you to think I'm just this. He gestured vaguely at the expensive suit, the office, the life he'd built. I was you once, desperate, trying to survive. Elena's throat tightened. What changed? I stopped waiting for someone to save me. I saved myself. There was something raw in his voice, vulnerable. And for the first time, Elena saw him, really saw him, not the billionaire, not the cold, untouchable man in the tuxedo, just Adrian. A week later, Marco met Adrian for the first time. Elena had been nervous about it. Marco was only 14, but he was smart, perceptive. He'd see through the act immediately. But when Adrian walked into the hospital room, Marco's face lit up. You're the guy from the magazines, Marco said, grinning. Are you really my sister's boyfriend? Adrian glanced at Elena, then back at Marco. Yeah, he said, I am. At least, for now. Marco frowned. What does that mean? Elena jumped in quickly. It means he's busy, but he's here when it matters. Adrian sat down beside Marco's bed. What are you reading? He asked, nodding at the book in Marco's lap. A coding book. I want to make games someday. Adrian smiled, a real smile. Good. The world needs more people who create things. They talked for an hour, about games, about technology, about dreams. And when they left, Marco pulled Elena aside. I like him, he whispered. He's not like the other guys you've dated. Elena's heart squeezed. Yeah, she said quietly. He's not. That night, Elena sat alone in her apartment, staring at her journal. She picked up her pen and wrote, This isn't a contract anymore. This is a story. She didn't know if Adrian felt the same, but she knew deep down that something had changed, and there was no going back. Everything fell apart at the Milan Gala. It was the biggest event of the season. Everyone who mattered was there. Investors, executives, journalists, and Veronica. Veronica Castellano, Corporate lawyer, stunning, sophisticated, and Adrian's former fiancée. Well, not exactly. It had been arranged by their families. A business merger disguised as a romance. Adrian had called it off 2 years ago, but Veronica had never let it go. She arrived at the gala in a blood-red gown, her eyes fixed on Adrian the moment she walked in. Elena felt it immediately, the shift in the room, the whispers. She's here. This is going to be interesting. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Veronica glided over, champagne glass in hand, her smile sharp as a knife. Adrian, she purred, it's been too long. Veronica, her gaze slid to Elena, cold and assessing. And this must be the girlfriend. She said the word like it was a joke. Elena forced a smile. Elena, nice to meet you. How quaint. Adrian stepped closer to Elena, his hand finding hers. We should go, he said quietly. But Veronica wasn't done. Adrian, darling, can I borrow you for a moment? Just business. I'm sure your companion won't mind. Before Elena could respond, Veronica had already looped her arm through Adrian's and led him away. Elena stood there alone in a sea of strangers, her heart sinking. This was the reality. She was just the hired girlfriend, the placeholder, and everyone knew it. A group of women nearby started whispering, loud enough for Elena to hear. She's not even from our world. I heard she's just a contract. He's paying her to be here. God, how embarrassing. Elena's face burned. She wanted to disappear, to run. But then she saw Adrian across the room. Veronica was leaning in close, whispering something in his ear, her hand on his chest. And Adrian looked trapped. Suddenly, Veronica's voice rang out across the ballroom. Everyone, can I have your attention, please? The music stopped. The crowd turned. Veronica stood on the small stage, microphone in hand, her smile venomous. I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate Adrian on his new arrangement. She gestured toward Elena. It's so refreshing to see someone willing to play a part for the right price. Gas rippled through the crowd. Elena's blood ran cold. After all, Veronica continued, we all know this is just a contract, right? 6 months. Very generous payment. I have to admire the commitment to the role. Cameras started flashing. Guests murmured. Some laughed. Elena stood frozen, humiliation crashing over her in waves. Adrian's face went white with fury. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed the microphone from Veronica's hand, and turned to face the crowd. You want to know the truth? He said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Everyone fell silent. Adrian walked over to Elena, who was trembling, her eyes filled with tears. He took her hand. The truth is, he said, his voice softer now, I hired her. Yes, it was a contract, a business arrangement. Elena's heart shattered. He was going to confirm it, in front of everyone. But then Adrian turned to her, his eyes locked on hers. But somewhere along the way, he said quietly, it stopped being a contract. He reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. Somewhere along the way, I stopped pretending. The room held its breath. Adrian looked back at the crowd. I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. Elena is not a contract. She's not a transaction. She's not a role. He turned back to her, his voice breaking. She's the only real thing in my life. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Just one kiss, he whispered, echoing the words from that first night. But this time, it wasn't for show. Elena's breath caught, and then Adrian kissed her. Not a performance, not a calculated move for the cameras. A real kiss. Deep, desperate, honest. The ballroom erupted. Some gasped, some clapped, some looked away in shock, but Adrian didn't care. When he finally pulled back, he looked into Elena's eyes. I was supposed to keep this professional, he said, his voice rough. But I can't. I won't. He turned to the crowd one last time. If she's a contract, then I signed it with my whole heart. And as of tonight, she's the only person I choose. Contract or not. Veronica stood frozen, her face pale with rage. The crowd was silent. And then slowly, someone started clapping. Then another. and another, until the entire ballroom was applauding. Adrian took Elena's hand and led her toward the exit, ignoring the cameras, the questions, the chaos. Outside, under the stars, Elena finally found her voice. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. Adrian looked at her, his eyes raw. "Because I meant every word. But the board, the investors, this could ruin everything you've built." "Then let it burn," he said fiercely. "I built an empire, but I was empty until you." Elena's tears spilled over. "Adrian, I love you," he said. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. But I do." Elena laughed through her tears. "You're an idiot. I know. You just destroyed your reputation for a girl you hired off a contract. I know." She grabbed his face and pulled him down into another kiss. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. And for the first time in his life, Adrian felt free. If you believe that real love can break any contract, leave a heart below. The fallout was immediate. The story went viral. Headlines everywhere. Billionaire declares love for contract girlfriend. Adrian Moretti risks empire for hired romance. Real or fake? The love story that shocked Milan. The board called an emergency meeting. Investors panicked. Stock prices fluctuated. Adrian didn't care. He showed up to the meeting, Elena by his side, and said 5 words. "I'm not apologizing." "She stays." The board threatened, argued, demanded he end the relationship. Adrian stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said calmly, "Then I resign." The room went silent. "You built this company," one of the directors sputtered. "You can't just walk away." "Watch me." Elena grabbed his arm. "Adrian, wait. You don't have to do this." He turned to her, his expression soft. "Yes, I do. I spent my whole life building something to prove I was worth something, but none of it means anything without you." In the end, the board backed down. They couldn't afford to lose him, and deep down, they knew the publicity, controversial as it was, had actually boosted the company's profile. But Adrian and Elena needed space. They left Milan, drove down to the coast, to a small house Adrian had bought years ago, a place he'd never told anyone about. It was simple, modest, overlooking the sea. Marco came with them. His treatments were going well thanks to Adrian's quiet intervention. He'd paid for everything, never asked for recognition. The 3 of them spent their days together, cooking meals, walking on the beach, laughing. One afternoon, Adrian suggested they plant something. "A tree?" Marco asked. "An olive tree," Adrian said. "They live for centuries. I want to plant something that lasts." They dug together, the 3 of them, their hands covered in dirt. When the small sapling was finally in the ground, Adrian stood back and smiled. "This tree will be here long after we're gone," he said quietly. "Just like what we're building together." Elena slipped her hand into his. "A family," she said softly. "A family," he repeated. That night after Marco went to bed, Elena and Adrian sat on the terrace, watching the stars. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. "Everything you gave up for me?" Adrian turned to her, his eyes serious. "I didn't give up anything. I traded an empire for a home. That's not a loss. That's the best deal I ever made." Elena laughed, tears in her eyes. "You're such a businessman." "Maybe. But I'm your businessman." She rested her head on his shoulder. "What happens when the 6 months are up?" she asked quietly. "The contract ends next week." Adrian was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Contracts end, but families don't." Elena looked up at him. "What does that mean?" He smiled. "You'll see." A few days later, Marco asked the question Elena had been too afraid to ask. They were in the kitchen making dinner. Adrian was chopping vegetables with surprising skill. "Adrian," Marco said hesitantly. "Yeah? When the contract ends, are you going to leave?" The knife stopped. Adrian set it down slowly. He turned to Marco, crouched down so they were eye level. "Marco, listen to me. The contract was just a piece of paper. What I feel for your sister, that's real, and real things don't have expiration dates." Marco's eyes filled with tears. "So you're staying?" Adrian glanced at Elena, who was watching from the doorway, her hand over her mouth. "Yeah, kid," Adrian said, his voice thick. I'm staying. Marco threw his arms around Adrian, who closed his eyes and held him tight. Elena walked over, joining the embrace. And in that small kitchen, in that simple house by the sea, they became something more than a contract. They became a family. Later that night, Elena found Adrian sitting on the terrace, staring out at the olive tree. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How different my life looks now," he said. "A year ago, I had everything. Money, power, success." He turned to her. "But I had nothing that mattered. And now?" "Now," she prompted. "Now I have everything that matters." Elena sat beside him, her head on his shoulder. "The contract ends in 3 days," she whispered. "I know." "What are we going to do?" Adrian smiled. "Write a new one." Elena pulled back, confused. "What?" "A new contract," he said, his eyes twinkling. "One that doesn't end. One that's not about appearances or business or money." He took her hand. "One that's just about us." Elena laughed, wiping away tears. "That's not a contract, Adrian. That's called a relationship." "Then let's call it that." She kissed him softly. "Deal." If you believe that happiness can grow from an arrangement, hit like to spread the word. 3 months later. The original contract sat in a drawer in Adrian's office, forgotten. In its place, on his desk, was a framed photograph. Elena, Adrian, Marco, standing under the olive tree, the sea sparkling behind them. It was the only picture Adrian kept in his office now. Everything else, the awards, the magazine covers, the symbols of his success had been put away. This was what mattered. One evening, Adrian asked Elena to meet him on the beach. She arrived at sunset, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink. Adrian was standing by the water, his hands in his pockets, looking nervous. "What's wrong?" she asked, walking over. "Nothing's wrong," he said. I need to ask you something." Elena's heart started to race. Adrian took a deep breath. "When we started this, I made you sign a contract. I controlled everything. The terms, the timeline, the rules." He pulled the old contract out of his pocket, worn and folded. "But I was wrong. Love isn't something you can write down. It's not something you can control." He held up the contract, then slowly tore it in half. Elena gasped. "Adrian, I don't want a contract anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't want terms and conditions and expiration dates." He dropped to one knee. Elena's hands flew to her mouth. "I want forever," he said, pulling out a small velvet box. "I want messy. I want real. I want you, every day, for the rest of my life." He opened the box. A simple ring, elegant, understated, perfect. "Elena, will you marry me? Not because of a contract, not because of money or appearances or any of that," his voice broke. "Just because I love you, and I can't imagine my life without you." Elena was crying too hard to speak. She nodded frantically, dropping to her knees in front of him. "Yes," she sobbed. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, and they held each other as the waves crashed around them. When they finally pulled apart, Elena laughed through her tears. "You know what's funny?" she said. "What?" "I came into this thinking I was selling my smile, playing a part, pretending." She touched his face. "But you gave me the realest thing I've ever had." Adrian kissed her forehead. "We saved each other," he said simply. They walked back to the house hand in hand. Marco was waiting on the terrace, trying to act casual. But when he saw the ring on Elena's finger, he started jumping up and down. "I knew it! I knew it!" Elena laughed, pulling him into a hug. "You're stuck with us now." "Buddy," Adrian said, ruffling Marco's hair. "Good," Marco said, grinning. "You guys are way less boring than Elena's old boyfriends." They spent the evening together, cooking, laughing, making plans. And as the sun set over the sea, Elena looked around at her little family, her brother, her fiancé, their olive tree growing strong, and felt a peace she'd never known. Adrian caught her eye and mouthed, "I love you." She mouthed it back. No contract, no performance, no pretending. Just truth, just love, just them. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Elena whispered, "Do you ever think about how we started?" Every day, Adrian said. Do you regret any of it? He turned to face her, his eyes serious. Not a single second. That contract brought me to you, and you brought me home. Elena smiled, nestling closer. Some contracts are written on paper, she murmured, but the best ones are written on the heart. And those, Adrian whispered, never expire.